Well, welcome to the 700 Club and Merry Christmas to all. Well, we're just one step away. That's how close the U.S. is to approving a vaccine in the fight against the coronavirus. And Americans could be just days away from receiving the first doses.
Every 30 seconds, someone dies from COVID-19. So why are only half of Americans surveyed saying they're willing to take the shot? Caitlin Burke has the story.
One of the most critical moments in the fight against COVID-19 happened late Thursday afternoon over a Zoom call.
We do have a favorable vote.
That vote endorsing widespread use of Pfizer's coronavirus vaccine and putting the U.S. only one step away from an epic vaccination campaign against the virus that's killed more than 300,000 Americans.
We really want to treat this vaccine as the liquid gold that it is, because it's really the only tool that we have right now in our toolbox to cure this disease.
Next, it goes to the full FDA for authorization. And then within 24 hours, Pfizer will send out the first 2.9 million doses.
We can act quickly, and we intend to. We understand the urgency of the situation. We want to make sure we make the absolute best decision for the American people.
The Pfizer vaccine was found to be 95% effective, with no serious side effects. The first doses will go to healthcare workers and nursing home residents.
Personally, I cannot roll up my sleeve fast enough to get this vaccination.
A pivotal moment happening as the U.S. reaches another grim milestone. Over 3,000 deaths in a single day. That's a reported fatality from the virus every 30 seconds.
People still don't think this is a big deal. They think it's kind of fake news. It's not. It's real. The numbers are absolutely real.
But many Americans still have questions about the vaccines, with only about half saying in a new Associated Press poll that they're ready to take the shot. Pfizer says it can have 25 million doses of the vaccine for the U.S. by the end of December, and it likely won't be the only option for long. Officials are hopeful we'll have FDA authorization for vaccines from Moderna, AstraZeneca, and Johnson & Johnson as well, as health experts hope these medications will finally defeat the outbreak. Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
Well, this is something we've prayed for. We've prayed for medical breakthroughs. We've prayed for doctors, for scientists to have the insight in order to come up with a vaccine, and now they have. And this one's based on some unusual new technology having to do with the manufacture of RNA. And so it's mimicking the virus and then providing an immune response. And so I applaud this. This is a wonderful thing, a wonderful development. If you're at risk, and if you don't know if you're at risk, you're probably not, but if you are at risk, I would encourage you, please get a vaccine. There's all kinds of rumors on the internet that somehow or other there's going to be a microchip injected into you. This particular vaccine from Pfizer doesn't contain any fetal tissue at all. So all of the internet objections, if you're at risk, it would be much better for you to take whatever risk are associated with a new vaccine than to actually get the virus. If you get the virus and you're at risk, you face death. If you get the vaccine, you're now going to be 95% protected against that. That, in my opinion, is a good risk to take. In other news, the Texas lawsuit challenging the election results in 4 swing states is now gaining some support. John Jessup has that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
That's right, Gordon. 106 Republicans in Congress and multiple state attorneys general are now supporting that lawsuit, with 6 states asking the Supreme Court to let them join the Texas case as parties to the suit. It says government officials in 4 swing states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, and Wisconsin, violated the Constitution by changing election procedures, something they say that state legislatures are supposed to do. Those 4 states fired back at the suit Thursday, with Pennsylvania calling the case a meritless abuse of the judicial process. And multiple legal analysts believe it is a long shot. Even so, many Republicans are urging the Supreme Court to hear the case. Well, in Georgia, early voting for the state's Senate runoffs begins soon. Voters there determining not only who will fill Georgia's 2 Senate seats, but also deciding who will control the Senate itself and the balance of power right here in Washington. CBN's Eric Phillips traveled to Georgia to cover the campaign.
The stakes are so incredibly high, and millions are being spent on both sides to get out the vote for the January 5th runoff election. But how should Christians view it? There are differing perspectives, even within the body of Christ.
It's very important because unless something changes, we're staring down the barrel of a Joe Biden presidency. I think for believers, it means everything.
I think we have to make sure that our voting is rooted in the values of the gospel.
No matter who you ask, the consensus is the Senate runoff election in Georgia is pivotal, especially for Christians. Ralph Reed heads the conservative Atlanta-based Faith and Freedom Coalition. He says Christians are called by God for such a time as this.
And he has placed us in the United States right now at this hour to be faithful witnesses to his glory and his goodness.
Reed says he wants to use the massive voting strength of evangelicals to tip the scales in favor of Republican Senators Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue because of what's at stake if the other side wins, including Israel's sovereignty.
Massive tax increases to gut the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which protects our First Amendment right to freedom of religion. Raphael Warnock is pro-abortion. He says that abortion on demand is entirely consistent with his view as a Christian minister. I don't know how you can support an agenda that extreme.
I always fight for their right to be wrong.
Reverend Billy Honor is a faith organizer in Georgia and has been pushing voters, particularly in historically marginalized communities, to engage by mail since 2018, when Democrat Stacey Abrams narrowly lost her bid for governor to Republican Brian Kemp.
I'm a gospel-centered type of civic-minded person. I've always said that, but mine is actually rooted in the gospel, and that is the Gospel of Luke, where he says that Jesus, I've come to open up the prison to those that are bound. Jesus says, I've come to say to all of them that this is your time.
Honor agrees Christians are called to action, but differs on what that means.
Who's wanting to open up hospitals in rural communities, and who's wanting to close them? Right? Who's wanting to expand access to health care, and who's wanting to reduce it, right? Who's wanting to expand access to unemployment insurance during this time of pandemic, and who wants to foreclose on it?
He says all people of faith, even Christians, won't vote the same way, a point Reed acknowledges as well. But both are working hard to make sure believers get to the polls.
You got one more vote, you know, that the job isn't done yet.
And I pray for us to continue to be found faithful.
Ralph Reed said the upcoming runoff election is not one of persuasion, but one of participation. In other words, whichever side gets more of its base to the polls will likely win. And no matter how you slice it, Christians make up a crucial part of the voting bloc. In Atlanta, Georgia, Eric Phillips, CBN News.
All right, thank you, Eric. Well, turning overseas, Morocco is the latest Arab country to agree to normalize diplomatic relations with Israel. President Trump making that announcement yesterday. The North African country becomes the fourth Arab nation in 4 months to make the move, all as a part of the Trump administration's Abraham Accords. The White House says the agreement will expand economic and cultural cooperation and advance stability in the region. Well, since the signing of the Abraham Accords between Israel and Arab nations, many have speculated Saudi Arabia might follow suit. But as CBN Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem, there are other factors at play.
Just this past week, a Saudi prince unexpectedly blasted Israel during a security conference in Bahrain, in a session ironically titled New Security Partnerships in the Middle East.
They profess that they want to be friends with Saudi Arabia. And yet, all Israeli governments are the last of the Western colonizing powers of the Middle East. From the time of the Balfour Declaration, they have forcibly evicted the inhabitants of Palestine after the 1948 war.
Israeli Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi spoke by video after the prince.
I would like to express my regret on the comments of the Saudi representative, the foreign minister. I don't believe that they reflect the spirit and the changes taking place in the Middle East.
The real question then is, does that say that the whole kingdom of Saudi Arabia has an attitude problem, or does it say that this guy has an attitude problem?
Former Israeli UN Ambassador Dori Gold also attended that conference, witnessing the prince's accusations.
I think he was being used by the highest authorities in Saudi Arabia to put some distance between us and them.
Gold tells CBN News the attitude toward Israelis appeared very warm, except for the prince. Gold believes Saudi Arabia could still come around, mainly because they have a common enemy.
I think it's the Iranian factor which gave birth to the Israeli-Arab peace process as we know it today.
Danny Danone, another former UN ambassador, tells CBN News he believes the Saudis will eventually join the Abraham Accords.
They are the most important one for the region, for Israel, and they understand that once they will normalize the relations with Israel, we will see much more stability in the region, and it will be a major force to block the hostility coming from Iran.
Gold points to Washington as being the major part of this puzzle. And what happens next?
If they hear from Washington, we like the Abraham Accords, we want more treaties between Israel and its neighbors, great.
Gold says while the Trump administration has improved the connection between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which led to opening its airspace to Israeli planes, it could all change if a Biden administration were to take a different approach.
If, on the other hand, they don't acknowledge that, they say, no, you want to improve the Middle East's environment, give the Palestinians more money and make the Palestinians the center of everything, that will not move us very far along.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Thanks, Chris. Gordon, how much does the prince's comments pour cold water on the warming relations with Israel?
Well, I hope it doesn't pour any cold water because factually it's just wrong. What he said is not the historical record. Here's the historical record. The League of Nations got together because they won World War I. In winning World War I, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved, and so countries were created. Iraq was created. Saudi Arabia was created. Syria, Lebanon, and the Palestinians were put into a special British mandate. In that mandate, the League of Nations at the San Remo conference said we need to establish a Jewish homeland and a Jewish state in the former lands owned by the Ottoman Empire. And that was the whole purpose of the British mandate. The Palestinians, it's a mistake to call them that because they didn't even call themselves that way back in the 1920s. They were Arabs. They were ethnic Arabs who had been brought in by the Ottomans to work their land, and they didn't own the land, the Ottomans did. So they steadfastly resisted a Jewish state and did so for pure reasons of anti-Semitism. To say that they were forcibly evicted is, again, an historical lie. When the Israeli state was announced in 1948, the Arab nations surrounding Israel all declared war against her, and they said to the Arab inhabitants, please evacuate because we don't want you to be a casualty in the war. When we win the war, you can move back. So to say it's a forcible eviction is, again, it's not part of the historical record at all. I'm really getting tired of the revisionist history. We also see the same revisionist history in President Obama's memoirs, where he's talking about a British occupation. It wasn't a British occupation at all. This was all established by international law. It was all established by the League of Nations and the UN specifically when it was formed after another World War, World War II. It adopted all of the policies of the League of Nations. So this is established international law. Israel has a right to exist, and it's high time for all the neighboring states to recognize that right. Now, we've got something that's happened under the current administration, under the Trump administration. It's a radical move. We're no longer going to focus solely on the Palestinian problem. We're going to go around it, and we're going to establish peace with each individual state and create a new bloc and a new alliance within the Middle East. It's an absolute brilliant stroke. Under Secretary of State John Kerry, he said, no, you can't do that. You can't have individual peace. You have to first solve the Palestinian problem. Well, when you look at the world that way, you end up with an insolvable problem because the Palestinians never want to solve the problem. They don't want a two-state solution. They do not want peace. And this has been the reality for 100 years now. Let's wake up to the reality. They want to drive Israel into the sea. They teach their children that. They reward people who kill Jews. They reward them based on the severity of the sentence that they receive in Israel for acts of terror. When you look at it from this point of view, our foreign policy on this has been absolutely nuts and has been that way for decades. It's so refreshing to find someone that says, no, this isn't the way anymore. And by all means, the American taxpayer isn't going to pay for this. And so we're going to stop paying the Palestinian Authority and we're going to stop paying UNRWA. Well, elections have consequences. And here's some consequences that we should be looking at. Number one, Biden has already said he's going to reinstitute payments to the Palestinian Authority and to UNRWA. I find that absolutely unbelievable. Legally, he's going to have a problem because of the Taylor Force Act and because of another terrorism act that was passed in 2018. So he's going to face legal challenges to this because if any of the money goes to those terrorists, he's got a big problem. Here's the second problem. He's been encouraged to reactivate the Iranian treaty on its current level with no renegotiation. I find this absolutely incredible that we would try to bring this back up after it's so plain that they're trying to develop a nuclear weapon, and they were using that treaty as a cover for it. This is incredible. For Iran to get a nuclear weapon is unbelievable, completely destabilizing to the region. And that's one of the keys to the Abraham Accords. It's trying to create an alliance against Iran and Iran's aggression, which has been evident. They launched drone attacks against the refineries in Saudi Arabia. They've used proxies against our own troops in Iraq. They have been funding Hamas and other terror groups for decades. They are the #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world today. Now, here's something that just happened. Representative Gregory Meeks, he's the incoming chair of the House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee. This man has real power. He wrote a letter to Biden saying, please reinstitute the Iranian treaty without any renegotiation. I find it incredible that a congressman with that kind of authority and that kind of information would write that letter. But that's what we're facing. That's what we're looking at. I hope the Biden administration, I hope the incoming Secretary of State, I hope they all wake up to this and say nuclear Iran is a non-starter for us. Let's go forward with the Abraham Accords. Let's not make the Palestinian Authority the deciding issue in the Middle East. Let's create coalitions to come against what is quite clearly an aggressive power using terrorism, using drones. If they get nuclear weapons, the game's over.